Hello, everyone, and welcome to this extraordinary special event featuring renowned historian Annette Gordon-Reed with her important and timely new book on Juneteenth. Professor Gordon-Reed will be in conversation with award-winning ABC 13 news anchor Melanie Lawson. My name is Rich Levy, Executive Director of Inprint, Houston's leading literary arts organization, and we are proud to be hosting this event tonight with our friends at the Houston Museum of African American Culture. John Guest, excuse me, the museum's CEO emeritus and founder, has since 2012 constantly kept the museum at the center of national arts and culture discussions, especially the difficult ones, and this has been a Juneteenth weekend to remember. John.
American culture.
There you are. There you are. Hello. Sorry. How are you?
Hi, how are you?
Good to see you. Little did we know we would be presenting this event tonight after Juneteenth was declared a federal holiday. Amazing.
There was so much Juneteenth activity this year as opposed to last year, and that was before any thoughts that there would be a national holiday. It was everywhere. It was great. It was a big celebration.
Well, it's very exciting. I have to admit, as a literary organization, we are not used to being on the cusp of breaking news.
That's true.
Well, let me turn it over to you, John. Thank you.
Thanks, Rich. Well, the Houston Museum of African American Culture, HMAC, is thrilled to host again with Inprint a conversation with an important and influential writer for our local and national audiences. We are particularly happy about tonight's discussion between our own Emmy Award-winning journalist Melanie Lawson and Texas-born Pulitzer Prize winner writer Annette Gordon-Reed on Reed's book on Juneteenth. Following HMAC's recent exhibition, Fresh and Contemporary, where national artists challenge viewers to use this potential reckoning to reconsider fixed ideas and engage anew in an important conversation about what we've been told and what we're telling others regarding race and gender. As I told Professor Gordon-Reed earlier today, the book on Juneteenth does exactly that. This past Saturday, along with Cinema Arts Society, HMAC presented the Texas shot film Miss Juneteenth by Channing Godfrey Peoples and the Houston premiere of her Dorothea's Blues at Moonstruck Drive-In. This Wednesday, again with the Cinema Arts Society, we will present the 2021 Sundance Documentary Grand Jury Prize and Audience Award-winning film Summer of Soul for free as part of a Black Music Month celebration. We have currently on view our curated version of the celebrated ACA Gallery show, A Black Perspective, featuring work by 4 African-American masters, Faith Ringgold, Romare Bearden, Amina Robinson, and Richard Mayhew, along with Houston Abstraction, where HMAC unpacks the work of artist Dan Houston, encouraging visitor engagement with an African-American abstract artist. As the only African-American cultural asset to own a Confederate monument, the Spirit of the Confederacy, we followed up HMAC writing fellow Willow Curry's engagement to define the spirit as what hatred looks like, with John Sims' Memorial Day Burn and Bury the Confederate Flag ceremony, and will conclude his residency with a listening session of his Afro-Dixie remixes. Finally, we are delighted to continue our decades-long close association with Ava DuVernay and her Array Film Distribution Group. This time, however, focusing on art, as HMAC becomes a major participant in her LEAP project that has commissioned 5 artists to create works that focus on identifying not simply the victims of police brutality, but to put faces on the officers involved. In mid-July, we're the national opening through the summer of artist Delita Martin's 6x8-foot mural, Blue is the Color We See When We Die, that will then travel around the country. Again, thanks to Imprint for once again partnering with HMAC to host this conversation on this important work by Professor Annette Gordon-Reed. Enjoy.
Thank you, John. Very good. A word or two about Inprint. We are a nationally recognized Houston-based nonprofit that empowers storytellers across the community and champions great books and the people who write them. One of our flagship programs is the Inprint Margaret Root Brown Reading Series, which since 1980 has presented nearly 400 great writers from 36 countries, winners of 10 Nobel Prizes, 64 Pulitzer Prizes, 57 National Book Awards, 51 National Book Critics Circle Awards, 16 Booker Prizes, as well as 19 U.S. Poets Laureate. This season presented entirely, as we do tonight, via the Inprint Virtual Studio, marks the 40th anniversary of the Inprint Brown Reading Series, featuring leading authors whose work inspires and provokes conversation and reflection. We are happy to present tonight's program as a special event of the series. Next Sunday, June 27th at 4 p.m. Central Time, we are thrilled to present acclaimed children's author Jacqueline Woodson with her new middle grade novel in verse, Before the Ever After, as part of our Inprint Cool Brains series. Jackie has published more than 30 books for children, including Brown Girl Dreaming, winner of the National Book Award. She was named the 2018 Ambassador for Young People's Literature by the Library of Congress and was selected for a MacArthur Fellowship. Kids, if you're out there, or parents of kids, please email us video questions for Jacqueline Woodson to be played on the air, and we will mail you a free hardcover copy of her new book. Please see our website, imprinthouston.org, for details. And this summer, the Inprint Book Club will continue discussing books online by authors featured in the Inprint Brown Reading Series. Next up, on July 11th, the book club will explore poet Jericho Brown's Pulitzer Prize-winning collection, The Tradition. Inprint also presents writers' workshops for aspiring writers in English and Spanish, free community workshops across the city for senior citizens, school teachers, healthcare providers at the Texas Medical Center, veterans, the incarcerated at Harris County Jail, and others, many of which are running online. We invite you to learn about all of this, plus the Inprint archive of readings, the fellowships and prizes we provide to top emerging authors at the University of Houston, and much more at our website, imprinthouston.org. The Inprint Margaret Root Brown Reading Series is made possible by the Brown Foundation. The series is named for one of its founders, Margaret Root Brown, and the National Endowment for the Arts. We are also deeply grateful to the Jerry C. Deering Family Foundation, Houston Endowment, the City of Houston through the Houston Arts Alliance, and the Texas Commission on the Arts. Our thanks also to Live Right Publishing for making this event possible. The way this will work tonight, Professor Gordon Reed will briefly talk about and read from on Juneteenth, and then she will join in conversation with Melanie. Before I introduce Annette, I want to remind you to please buy your copies of On Juneteenth from Kindred Stories, our bookseller for this event, and Houston's new Black-owned indie bookshop. Kindred Stories is offering a 10% discount on the book through Wednesday. The discount code is Inprint, which you enter at checkout. Visit them online at kindredstorieshtx.com. And Kindred Stories has another very special offer for patrons of this event. From their website, you can claim a free copy of the new audiobook of On Juneteenth while supplies last. Free audiobook at kindredstorieshtx.com, the audiobook of On Juneteenth. Don't delay, please. What an honor to present Annette Gordon Reed with this small but powerful new book. Currently the Carl Loeb University Professor at Harvard, Harvard's highest faculty honor, she has won 16 major book prizes and is both a professor at Harvard Law School and a major American historian. UT historian H.W. Brands writes in the New York Times Book Review, Gordon Reed has earned acclaim as one of the most important American historians of our time. Her many honors include a MacArthur Genius Fellowship awarded in 2010. On their website, I like this, they write, fascinated from childhood by the Jefferson family, Gordon Reed began a comprehensive re-examination of the evidence about the rumored committed relationship between Thomas Jefferson and his slave Sally Hemings. Independent of her responsibilities as a law professor, she wrote her first book, Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, An American Controversy, in 1997. Although she is not a formally trained historian, Gordon Reed drew on her legal training to apply context and reasonable interpretation to the sparse documentation about the shared lives of her protagonists. After publication, An American Controversy received skeptically by some, but her conclusions were confirmed in 1998 when DNA evidence supported the documentary evidence of Jefferson's genetic paternity. She has continued her work on colonial interracial relations with her 2008 book, The Hemingses of Monticello, An American Family, which won both the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award, among many other honors. There's more, including the award-winning memoir, Vernon Can Read, which she co-wrote with Vernon Jordan, former CEO of the National Urban League, and another acclaimed book on Thomas Jefferson, written with noted historian Peter Onuf. And now we have On Juneteenth, climbing the New York Times bestseller list, beautifully written, amazingly well-timed, and admittedly her most personal work. And to top it off, Juneteenth is finally a federal holiday. I must admit she's got her fellow Texans pegged. As she notes in the book, it's a very Texas move to say that something that happened in our state was of enough consequence to the entire nation that it should be celebrated nationwide. Please welcome Annette Gordon Reed. Hello, Annette.
Hi, how are you doing? That's a great, wonderful introduction. I'm very happy to be here.
Well, we're so glad to have you. Thank you so much for being with you tonight. And I'll turn it over to you.
Yes, well, I'm very happy to be here this evening. It's nice to be in conversation with Melanie Lawson, someone that I've heard of and known for a good part of my life, and to be talking to Texans about this very Texas book. I originally thought that I would be doing a big book about Texas, a huge book about Texas, I should say, something along the lines of The Hemingses of Monticello, where I would talk about the development of slavery there. But this summer, during the course of the pandemic, I decided that I would do something smaller and something more intimate and more personal. I was here in Manhattan, in ground zero for the COVID pandemic. There was not much to do besides take walks in the park with my husband for exercise and occasionally go out on errands for food and provisions and so forth. But for the most part, it was life in the apartment. I had written an essay for The New Yorker about Juneteenth, about growing up and celebrating Juneteenth in my family, with my family in Conroe, Texas, and Livingston, Texas. And I had done a book review for the New York Review of Books about Texas, the year before, 5 books about Texas history. So Texas had been on my mind even before this happened. But during the pandemic, being here isolated, I began to think about my parents. I thought about, what would they make of this incredible moment that we were in, where the whole world was being held hostage by this virus, sort of teaching us who was really boss in the world, and how they would view that. And I began to miss them. And I thought then that I would think about them through writing, to try to make some connection to them, make connection to the past through telling stories about my family. But I have a complex relationship with memoirs. I'm not so sure that I like them so much how I feel about them. But I mean, there's some that I like and some that I don't like. I'd never thought of, not seriously, of writing a memoir. And I decided, however, that one way to get in touch with my parents and my family was to talk about my past. But I didn't want to do it in a way that talked, that was just a sort of a personal family history. I also wanted to talk about Texas. Because as I was writing those other pieces, it occurred to me that Texas is sort of a mysterious place to people. There are lots of, if not mysterious, I should say, that there are a lot of things that people misunderstand about Texas. And you hear news about Texas all the time. And one thing that I've been doing since I left Texas to come to college in New England, to go to college in New England and then law school and then settled in New York, is that I've been explaining Texas to people for a very, very long time. And so I thought that I could try to develop a work that would allow me to get in touch with my parents and my past life, and talk about Texas and explain Texas with an emphasis on the second part. I mean, I would talk about the family enough to introduce the stories that I thought needed to be told about Texas, but not so much that our family became the focus. This is really a book about Texas through Juneteenth. It's called On Juneteenth because I talk about the day, the actual history surrounding that particular day, and because I talk about the days leading up to it and afterwards. On Juneteenth is the sort of a commentary on all of the things that surround the holiday, a holiday that was made necessary by the institution of slavery, really, and then the aftermath of that institution with Jim Crow in Texas and the sort of battle against that and a struggle that African Americans have been on in that state up until today. So I thought I would read the beginning, a little bit from the beginning of the book to give you a flavor of what I'm talking about here. This is from the preface to the book. To my surprise, some years back, I began to hear people outside of my home state, Texas, talk about and actually celebrate the holiday Juneteenth. June 19th, 1865, shortened to Juneteenth, was the day that enslaved African Americans in Texas were told that slavery had ended. 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation had been signed, and just over 2 months after Confederate General Robert E. Lee had surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox. Despite the formal surrender, the Confederate Army had continued to fight on in Texas until mid-May. It was only after they surrendered that Major General Gordon Granger, while at his headquarters in Galveston, prepared General Order No. 3, announcing the end of legalized slavery in the state. The truth is, I confess here, that I was initially annoyed, at least mildly so, when I first heard that others outside of Texas claimed the holiday. But why? After all, it was a positive turn of events in history, evidence that our country was leaving behind, or attempting to, a barbarous institution that had blighted the lives of millions. Such a thing should be celebrated far and wide. My twinge of possessiveness grew out of the habit of seeing my home state and the people who reside there as special. The things that happened there couldn't have happened in other places. Non-Texans could never really understand what the events that took place in Texas actually meant. I'm certain that I'm not alone in this attitude. From my earliest days, it was drummed into me, and I believed other young people growing up in Texas at that time, that we inhabited a unique place that we were always supposed to claim and of which we were always supposed to be proud. I've noticed over the years that it is hard to meet a person from Texas who does not, at some point in the conversation, let you know, either with a drawl or without, that he or she is from the state. My proprietary attitude about Juneteenth quickly disappeared. Rather than keeping the holiday to ourselves, Texans have been in the forefront of trying to make Juneteenth a national holiday. As I think of it, it's really a very Texas move to say that something that happened in our state was of enough consequence to the entire nation that it should be celebrated nationwide. It has been offered as part of the justification that the end of slavery in Texas was the end of the institution, period. That's not quite true. Granger's order did not end slavery in the country. That did not happen officially until December 1865, when the 13th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified by the necessary number of states. But it is significant that Texas was the site of the tail end of the Confederate war effort. As the war had been fought to preserve slavery, celebrating Juneteenth throughout the land is a fitting way to mark the end of that effort. It is also fitting to think of Texas in relation to the nation for another reason. The state has been described as a bellwether for what the United States will become. The term Texification has come into use to describe a process that is supposedly of recent origin. The history of Juneteenth, which includes the many years before the events in Galveston and afterward, shows that Texas, more than any state in the Union, has always embodied nearly every major aspect of the story of the United States. That fact has been obscured by broad caricatures of the state and its people, caricatures that Texans themselves helped to create and help make the state seem exotic, almost foreign to the rest of the Union. The essays that follow do not strive to present a chronological narrative of the place where Juneteenth was born. They are instead designed to provide a context for an event that has become increasingly important in the life of the American nation. It's a look at history through the medium of personal memoir, a Texan's view of the long road to Juneteenth, the events surrounding the date, what happened afterwards, and how all of this shapes life in Texas, my family's life, and my own. My Texas roots go deep. On my mother's side, back to the 1820s. On my father's side, at least the 1860s. Significantly, my wide-ranging approach to Juneteenth reveals that behind all of the broad stereotypes about Texas is a story of Indians, settler colonialists, Hispanic culture in North America, slavery, race, and immigration. It is the American story, told from this most American place.
Thank you so much, Annette. That is a totally perfect introduction to the book. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's great. And now let's welcome Melanie Lawson. During her career at ABC 13 News, she has won many awards for her reporting. This is after she was an attorney when these two folks knew each other, and including an Emmy for her coverage of President Clinton's visit to South Africa, the only local reporter in the nation to make the trip. Melanie has interviewed a wide range of notables, including 3 U.S. presidents, the Dalai Lama, Maya Angelou, and for Inprint, Ta-Nehisi Coates and Britt Bennett. Melanie, it's all yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Rich. And thank you, Annette Gordon-Reed. First of all, let me say welcome home. On
Yes,
behalf
thank
of
you.
all of us here, that's right, you were just up the road a piece in Conroe, so we are glad to have you back in Texas, at least virtually, and delighted to talk about your book, which is such an incredible read, fascinating, and really just sort of capsulizes so many things. I should urge everybody out there, if you haven't had a chance to pick up the book, I cannot recommend it highly enough. It's 140 pages, give or take, but just brilliantly written, and you would be doing yourself a disservice if you did not pick it up. I love Annette, the fact, and by the way, I'm going to call her Annette, so I hope no one gets offended. We've decided we're close enough already virtually that that's okay. So I wanted to make sure I say that right up front. Um, but I love the part that you just read because I think all of us feel as though Texas is ours and it's only supposed to be certain things are only supposed to happen here and be celebrated here. And I think at some point, all of us have been in another state and thought, well, what do you mean they're celebrating Juneteenth there? What's going on? Why do you think, though, there was such a push for there to be a national holiday called Juneteenth, especially when you look up in 47 states in the District of Columbia were celebrating that? Why do you think it needed to be a national holiday?
Well, I think, Texans pushed it. We've been people from Texas have been very, very adamant about this. Miss Opal Lee, who, the 94-year-old who's been involved in this, she said since she was 89, took this up as a cause. I think people want a time to think about the end of slavery. It makes sense to celebrate something that was a victory not just for Texans, but a victory for the Union. But also, I think it's sort of a landmark in human rights. I mean, to have slavery ended, actually it was a military operation that ended slavery with the end of the Confederacy deciding to surrender. I think it was a momentous event, and we should take note of this to think about the joy that those people felt when they learned that they were no longer going to be treated as property. That's worth pausing over. And I know that there are other states that have days that they associate with emancipation, but Texans, for the reason that I mentioned and that I was reading there, have an outsized sense of themselves and they took this holiday with them across the country. When they left Texas and they moved to California or Detroit or other places, they said we celebrated this and it should be celebrated here as well. So I think we owe this to the tenacity of Texans who kept this story alive for 156 years, and in a way that I think really does honor to the ancestors of Black people who were enslaved in Texas.
Well, and we really do have to go to the headline, the fact that this was passed by the Senate unanimously. Even though they're split right down the middle, it was passed by the House with only 14 Republicans voting against it. And then signed by the president, all happening within a matter of a few days. And when you think about that, it is such a remarkable occurrence. But what do you see as the significance of that? And I know you were actually in the room where it happened, to quote Hamilton. But what did you see as the significance of it as you sat there right behind Miss Opal Lee?
Well, I thought it was a testament to the resilience. It's sort of a testament to the resilience of African American people, as I said, who for keeping this story alive. But the significance is that we now have national attention, that this holiday will join other important holidays, July 4th, Memorial Day, Martin Luther King Day, as a day that the entire country is supposed to pause and think about the history of the day. I mean, Juneteenth is tailor-made for history. You have to tell the story. You have to explain what happened. And so, we can be afraid of that it might be commodified and some of the issues that people have raised with me earlier. But I really think that's not going to happen easily, because I think people will work to keep the history alive and to tell the story. And even just telling the story, you invite other questions. Why? Why was slavery a thing? What has slavery, how has it shaped us? Are we still living under the influence of all those kinds of things? So I think having a national day to ponder these questions is really important.
And why now, do you think? And in some ways, I'd love you to put us in the room on the day that this all unfolded. But why now? It's been really debated for decades.
Well, I mean, last year was an amazing year, 2020, with the murder of George Floyd, that touched off, well, the pandemic, which I think those things were related. When the murder of George Floyd brought out thousands of people, not just in every state of the union, but all over the world. I mean, I was astonished by the intensity of the response, the size of the response in every major capital around the world. And I don't wonder if going through the pandemic, where people were forced to think about how we are connected as human beings, how, what one person does affects another person. We were at home and we could think about this and ponder these situations. It started a conversation about race that I think had influence on this day, the way people saw this day. Last year saw a tremendous rise in searches and discussions about Juneteenth. I mean, it's been steadily rising over the years. I noticed over the past decade, but this was sort of a high point for it. And I do think people were thinking about, how did we get here? How do we get in a situation where something like that could happen? And people understand that slavery created a racial hierarchy. And dismantling slavery, at the end of slavery in Texas, did not end that hierarchy. And so we've been working towards that since that moment. And so I think it was just the timing of it created a situation where people could talk about things in a way, in a very serious way, about the state of race or racial relations in the country.
On a very personal level, I want to know how you felt about all of this unfolding. I know you grew up celebrating Juneteenth, like many of us did in Texas, but you also know the darker side of living in Texas, and I want to get back to that in just a moment. But did you feel a real sense of emotion as you sat in that room, and especially in light of the fact that your book came out just at the perfect time? I know you have been talking to people, doing interviews like this for at least the last month, but I'm sure it hit a fever pitch after the law was passed. But how did you
Mm-hmm.
feel sitting in that room that day?
I felt privileged. I was a little worried because I got there before Miss Lee got there, and I was hoping that she would be able to make it because it was really her day, and I could just imagine what it would have been like to have done. I mean, she's walked, she's done walks for this, and she's been involved in this in all these years, and I just felt a state of, well, euphoria because everybody was happy. I mean, there were Congress people there, from the Republicans and Democrats. The Congressional Black Caucus was there, and everybody was happy. It was a festive occasion. And then when she came, it just sort of lifted it off even more, because everybody wanted her to there to be a part of all of it. So I felt a sense of history. I mean, you're in the East Room, and as a historian, this is the kind of thing that I would be writing about, obviously, about things like this that happened in the past, when the bill was signed, who was there, all of this. So I felt a deep sense of pride, as an American citizen, as a Texan, and I felt privileged as a historian to be able to watch a historic event. I mean, it's everything that you could hope for just in one day.
That's a perfect way to describe it. I probably would have boohooed all the way through it as well, just on a very emotional level. I do want to get now back to the book, the most important thing. I know, as you mentioned earlier, that you've been thinking about writing a historical tome really on Texas. You said you've been talking to your editor about that for a long time. But you ended up doing something very different, writing a much shorter book that sort of
Hmm.
combines history and a personal memoir. Why did you make that decision, and how difficult was it for you to make it so personal? I know that's really different for you.
Yeah. Well, when when I was growing up, I always thought that I would be a writer. And when I imagined myself as a writer, this is the kind of writing that I thought I would be doing. I didn't imagine that I would be writing big historical books with lots of endnotes. I liked reading those kinds of books in college and so forth. But when I was a kid, I thought I would write short stories and essays and novels like James Baldwin or something like that. So that style of writing. So I've wanted to get back to it. I've thought about that for a number of years, and this gave me an opportunity to do it. This was the perfect occasion I thought, to do it. And it was hard because I don't typically write about myself. And I went back and forth with my editor about, well, do I use names of everybody? And I ultimately decided just to use my mother's and my father's name and, a couple of other people. But I felt that if I did sort of like a family tree, it listed everybody, that it would become much more about my family and not about Texas, which is what I really wanted the book to be about. But there's reticence there because but for a historian, you try to be detached. You don't really want to put yourself in the middle of all of this. And here I am in the middle of it. I'm using my family to open up a story about um, the first black people in Texas, or to open up a story about Native Americans in Texas, or how we talk about the Alamo. All of those things. There's a personal component here, but the idea is to use that to open up the history of Texas. And so that's what I really wanted to show. So it's, it's hard because for history, you're supposed to have a level of detachment here. And I tried to maintain that, but if you're going to do the family, it necessarily brings you more into the picture that I'm used to doing. But once I got into it, it was fun. Because as I said, I was trying to, in a way, commune with my parents and my family. And that, because that part of it was there, it made it easier. It was it was meaningful to me. It was something that I wanted to do because it was satisfying. It was gratifying to have them live again in the stories that I was trying to tell about Texas and our lives there.
And in a lot of ways, as you indicated, it was almost a love letter to your parents and some of the
Hmm.
things that they went through. I wonder if, as you went back and kind of dredged up things that you'd forgotten almost about as a child, if uh, if that made it almost too personal sometimes, if you felt a little bit of, oh, maybe I shouldn't talk about that. And I want to talk specifically about you going to school, an all white school, when you were only 6 years old, the first Black child to attend that white school, a decision made by your parents. But I imagine they didn't sit you down and give you a long, sort of analytical understanding. They
No.
just said, you're going to this school next week, dropped you off, and kept on going. But did it feel sometimes almost like it was delving a little bit too deep, or was it really illuminating for you?
Well, I think it was more. I would say it was more illuminating for me
Mhm.
because the other thing I did while I was stuck in the pandemic was start going through my closets, and I found an essay that I had written about this a long time ago. I don't even remember writing it. It was sort of with courier type, there was a long time ago, and so this is something that's been in the back of my mind that I've wanted to talk about for a long time, but I had evidently just sort of put that away. Um, I think it was illuminating to me because I got a chance to think about the fact that my parents' reason for sending me to the white school, choosing to send me there, and I should say, Texas and other jurisdictions were trying to get around Brown versus Board of Education by creating what they call freedom of choice plans. And white parents were supposed to choose white schools, and black parents choose black schools. And my parents chose a white school. They bucked the plan, how people were supposed to act. In later years, after they became somewhat disillusioned about how integration had turned out, uh,
Mhm.
they said that it was just sort of a pragmatic choice on their part. They said we knew the court was going to strike down freedom of choice plans, and you would be in place once that took place. But they were more idealistic. I could sense it as a kid, and this was the mid '60s. The Civil Rights Act had been passed, the Voting Rights Act. Black people were on the move. There was sort of a spirit that we were all doing, that the world was changing, and I think they wanted to be a part of that. But, you know, they were concerned later on as they saw that integration was just mainly about the kids. It wasn't about the administration. It wasn't about the teachers. Many black teachers across the South were taken out of the classroom because white parents did not want their children being under the power or under the tutelage of black teachers. And so black kids lost role models, and white kids lost, the chance to have black teachers as role models. And so they were little concerned about that, and so they turned what had been an idealistic choice, I believe, into something that was much more pragmatic. So they didn't seem like they were naive. They didn't want to seem as if they had the wool pulled over their eyes in any kind of way. So it made me think about my parents in a different kind of way, to really analyze how they had presented this story over the years.
And we should mention that they were in education themselves and had been part of the Black School Booker T. I remember, which was kindergarten to 12th grade, I believe, read
Yeah.
there. Um, but when you did talk to them about it, and I don't know if you ever did, I thought it was interesting that you weren't taken to school by federal troops like Ruby Bridges and Little Rock. Your parents basically drove you up to the front door, dropped you off, and kept going. Did they have a talk with you at all about what it was going to be like to go to school with kids who looked different from you?
Not that I recall. I mean, I knew that they must have, but it's not anything that made a deep enough impression upon me for me to remember it. I had a relative who was very close to my mother. My mother had lived with her in Houston. She wanted to go to law school. Excuse me, go to high school in Houston, and she went to Sakowitz. Sakowitz was a department store, the big ritzy sort of department store in Houston, and she went and bought just mountains, boxes and boxes of dresses and clothes and so forth. I mean, I had clothes, but she just went overboard with all of this. So I mean, so I knew from things like that and things that people were saying, you're six, you're taking these things in. I knew that it was a big deal
Yeah.
that I was going to this school. And I think what my parents, what I remembered is that I was just supposed to try to be the best student I could be. And I loved school. That was a good thing about it, is that I loved school, and I was a good student. I wonder if things would have been different if I had struggled in any kind of way with that. But I enjoyed it, and my teacher, Mrs. Daughtry, was fabulous to me. It was wonderful. I mean, she was the perfect person for that. And maybe, and I'm sure, there was a talk about which first grade teacher was going to have me in her class, and they picked very, very well. And she was just great. Some kids were nice, and some were not nice to me. So it was a very intense time. But I guess what I'm getting at is I don't remember being sat down and said, now you have to do this, that, and the other, besides, you know, that you're supposed to be nice. You're supposed to be, you're supposed to do as the best you can. And that was just it. But I didn't ride the bus. My father did take me to schools in the morning. I think the bus may have been a bit too much, bridge too far there. But he took me to school in the mornings, and it was kind of normal, except for the fact that there would be occasionally administrators and educators would come and stand in the doorway and observe the classroom to see what it was like to have the black student in this class. And so I knew I was on display. But I just, when you kids, we do things, you don't realize how, you really don't think about it until later, and you think, wow, that was pretty. I mean, I have kids. I don't know that. I mean, my kids went to a private school that was predominantly white, but there were teachers there. There were other black teachers. There were black kids. I'm not sure if I would send my kid to a school where they were the only black person there. But I'm not in the time period that my parents were in. This was a spirit of adventure, a spirit of progress. And I think it's almost as if this sort of moved along by a certain kind of faith that everything was going to be okay.
Well, and just a couple of real quick questions before I wrap up this part. One is, you indicated that some of the kids were not so nice to you. And interestingly enough, it wasn't just the white kids. You also got some blowback from some of the black kids as well. And the other thing is, this didn't seem to be the result of a lawsuit your parents filed or anything like that. They just kind of decided one day that they were going to send you there. Did they talk to anybody about it? Or I was just
Well,
curious how you showed up that first day.
Well, yeah. I mean, everybody knew I was coming, but they talked to the school district and I think the newspaper there. They all decided that they wouldn't make a big deal about it. That, it would not be in the news. I would just go to school and I would start school. Oh, no, they very definitely talked to the administration and other people uh, about about my coming to Anderson, and as I said, that it was going to be low key. I would not be escorted into school. I don't know if there were police officers there. They could have been there other places. I did learn afterwards that there had been some threats against my family, but I don't know that they were thought to be credible. And it was just me, and they just handled it as if that this was the way that this was going to happen. It was only me, uh, and as I said, I was a good student, and I'm a pretty even-tempered person, and I've always been a pretty even-tempered person. So I don't know that I was that big a problem for people. But as you said, later on, when the Supreme Court struck down freedom of choice plans, because they said this is just a ruse, this is subterfuge, you're trying to get around Brown. And then the schools had to integrate, and that's when black people in the town, some black people in the town, were upset because they lost. Booker T. Washington was the nerve center of the black community, and the teachers lived in the community. They went to church with the kids and their families. They socialized with them, and they lost that. And I think that they blame me for it. I mean, the kids sort of hearing, you hear trickling down information and they get it all wrong. They may have thought that I caused all of this. And I have an anecdote in the book that I talk about a kid who's punching me in the chest. A kid I had no idea
Wow.
who he was. I knew why he was mad at me, because he blamed me for integration and the loss of his school. But I don't want to romanticize segregation, obviously. I mean, we had to sit in the balcony when we went to the movies, and had a separate waiting room at the local clinic. Being treated like a second-class citizen, you can't I can't condone that. But the truth of the matter is that there was something that was lost when they did integration the way it was, which was essentially to integrate the kids, but not the power structure and not the teachers as well.
Yeah. Interestingly enough, we were among the first kids to integrate here in Houston as well. So
Hmm.
as I read through that, I could relate to virtually every word you mentioned. Um,
Hmm.
Difference was there were a few of us. There wasn't just
Yeah.
one, and that would have been a much tougher situation. Well, this is a great segue into just talking a little bit about how you grew up, first in Livingston and then in Conroe. And you said you had some relatives who wouldn't come and stay overnight with you guys in Conroe. They might come and enjoy a little time, but they weren't going to stay there. Talk about growing up, and especially growing up in a small town. Now Conroe's a pretty big sized
It's
suburb.
British. Yeah.
Right,
Yeah,
right. But at
actually.
the time, it was a very different place.
Well, I was born in Livingston, and when I was 6 months old, my parents moved to Conroe, and uh, Conroe had a reputation as a really tough town racially. There had been lynchings there, there was Klan activity there at various points. A man had been burned at the stake, on
Wow.
Courthouse Square in the 20s, and that kind of stuff doesn't just disappear. I mean, the atmosphere, the feelings, those kinds of things linger. But I would have to say that thinking back on my childhood, I had a happy childhood. It was a small town childhood within the confines of my community. Uh, we rode our bikes, we walked around barefoot, were looked after by all the adults in the community had their eyes out for watching for you, and you could sort of wander around and do things. And it's like kids, is you have your parents and people who love you and who are taking care of you and trying to make you happy. You're happy, but there was I knew a sort of tension between blacks and whites that there were going into stores. I remember being in a store downtown and with my mother, and I touched something like a dress, and dress owner, I mean, the store owner just kind of went ballistic, like he thought that I would be dirty or something like that. And I don't think that would have happened if I had been white, or the kind of the real anger and the hostility or in his voice. And we, abruptly left, of course. And storekeepers, who were not nice to us, when we went into their stores, in these small convenience stores. So there was that. But within our community, and in my world, the world that I spent most of my time in with my parents and my friends and neighbors, I would say it was a happy childhood. But in the midst of this overlay of racial tension that existed, and that had been
Yeah,
long standing in a place that had had lynchings and those kinds of things take place.
yeah, because you talk about one lynching where people even had a picnic there in front of the courthouse
Yeah,
and watched. Yeah.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
What did your parents tell you about stuff like that? Did they say, don't go to that store, or did they,
Oh
uh,
yeah, we were not supposed to go to this particular store. Um, but sometimes, if I'm riding my bike, you run in to get bubble gum or something like that. And there was this guy who, the proprietor, I could just tell, you could just sort of feel the hostility that he had. I was a kid, and I knew that I hadn't done anything to him. So it was puzzling to me. What was this all about? And I knew very clearly early on that white people had very negative attitudes about black people, and that they were not. You could be nice, you could be, whatever, you could be smart, you could be whatever, or polite to them, and it didn't matter. There was just hatred there, and that's something that as a kid, I didn't understand.
yeah, I think even as adults, there are times when we don't understand that.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah. I mean,
yeah, talk a little bit about the happy times. And I've got to imagine that Juneteenth was one of those really happy times. Did you all celebrate? And if so, how did you celebrate?
well, um, it was very happy time. It was a day for kids to drink too much soda water,
Red soda
red soda
water.
water, red soda water, and black cat firecrackers. I still to this day can't believe that we were given matches and firecrackers below the age of 10. Something would never I would never think to do with my kids, but it was like, be careful, that was it, the sort of 60s and 70s parenting. um, Food, community. Juneteenth is a family holiday. It really is about gathering family and community. It's like a family reunion in certain, it was that way. And family, not just blood relatives, but, family friends, a feeling of camaraderie. And I've said, I really do think this urge to come together grows out of slavery, the fear of the loss of relatives through sale and being given away, all those kinds of things. Black people, family reunions, you go through the airports in the summer and you see all these people in T-shirts, the Richardson family reunion, all this. It's a big
Reunion.
deal because we really, that was the thing that enslaved people feared more than anything, is the loss of relatives. And so Juneteenth for us was at my grandmother's house, or if we celebrated at home, it was all people coming around, enjoying food, fun. Um, Later, when I began to understand more the serious part of it, that this was the end of the institution of slavery in Texas. My great grandmother was alive until I was 11, and I remember talking to her about it. And her mother had been enslaved as a child. She was freed by her father, and her mother was freed as well when she was a girl. And so my great grandmother knew, intimately knew somebody who'd been enslaved. I knew my great grandmother. That's that's not that far back,
Yeah.
you know, and we're talking about things that are really, really close in time. And I began to understand the importance of the day, but it has always been a day for a celebration and bringing together family. So that's how we celebrate it together with the community, um, sharing food, conversation, dominoes, cards, all kinds of things, to sort of commune with and be amongst one another and express joy.
And you've called it a blink of an eye when slavery has passed our way. I mean, it wasn't
Hmm.
that long ago, and certainly as you see some changes going on right
Hmm.
now. Let's go back to the book. I really want to talk about, as you describe it, it's really a book about Texas through the eyes of Juneteenth. And I think that one of the things I learned while reading it wasn't just that General Gordon Granger got to Texas 2.5 years late. It was also that Texas was really defiant in continuing slavery, even inviting people from other states where it had been outlawed to come on down to Texas. You can make money here and bring your slaves. What did that really say about the essence of our state and its resistance to ending slavery? And were you surprised by some of the things you discovered?
Well, well, it says that Texas was started as a place by Stephen F. Austin where slavery was going to be an important part of the labor system. The Republic of Texas, the Constitution, explicitly protects slavery and says that African American people can't be citizens. The United States Constitution kind of hides slavery, talking about persons held to service, but this is sort of openly protecting the institution. So that's not. I mean, I'm not for working on this book, I wasn't surprised by this. Going back when I was in college and when I learned most of all of this, it was sort of surprising to put all of these things together, to have to think about the Alamo in a different way, to say,
Yeah.
wait a minute, they're standing on their principles and they're fighting for their principles, and that's great. But some of their principles are, one of them is the maintenance of the institution of slavery in Texas. And so you have to think about things in different ways. Uh, Not so much hero worshiping of people, Jim Bowie and Davy Crockett and William Barrett Travis. I mean, you can admire their bravery and them standing on principles, but you have to think about what some of those principles were. And so then it can't just be blind worship, or to know that the Texas Republic, you know, was very protective of the institution of slavery and the people who came at the, as slavery was being outlawed in other places, as emancipation was taking place, coming to Texas, as you said, almost as like a final stand. Um, it makes you to think about, how you view Texas history and how I was taught Texas history. I mean, I'm sure now it's better than when I was a kid. I mean, better in the sense I had really good history teachers, but in terms of the coverage, I think they probably, I would imagine there's more coverage of this now, and that may be sparking some of the backlash that we've seen here about teaching about race and slavery. But it's a it made me think about things in a different way. That it was much more complicated than I thought it was.
Yeah, and you're actually talking about some of, as you mentioned, our heroes. The idea that Stephen F. Austin was really the man leading the charge to keep slavery alive. I also learned, and I don't think I realized this before, that Mexico, part of the reason Mexico and Texas ended up at odds was because of slavery. Mexico didn't
Hmm.
want it, Texas did. If you would elaborate just a little bit about that, because as I
Well, I
say, for
mean,
me, that's a revelation.
yeah. Well, the Mexican government had wanted Stephen F. Austin to bring settlers into Texas because he wanted Anglo settlers to be sort of a bulwark against indigenous people, that they would help fight the battle against Comanches and others in the state. But they weren't so keen on slavery, and in fact, Mexico outlaws slavery. And they made an exception for the Texas province, but the Texians were never secure in that they would leave them alone, and they thought that they might move against the institution. There were other things that they were concerned about. Santa Anna had suspended the Constitution. There were federalism issues, but they were really concerned about the loss of slavery because, you needed that labor system. They understood. I mean, Austin said at one point that if settlers came to Texas and didn't have slavery, that they could expect to be poor for many, many years. It was thought to be necessary. So that's one of the reasons they decided to leave and form their own republic, so that they could, I said there wasn't just, as I said, it wasn't just one reason, but slavery was a big reason that they wanted to leave Mexico and start their own republic, and they create this constitution, as I say, that explicitly protects slavery. And so they knew that anybody who came, any new settlers who came, because fewer people were reluctant to come after Mexico abolished slavery, but then more people came in and brought their slaves, and Texas became a full-fledged slave society.
I know I didn't learn a lot of this stuff in Texas history. I've got to
Mm-hmm.
assume that you didn't either. And you kind of alluded to the direction that history in many states is now taking, and in Texas for sure. And that's the whole idea of critical race theory and whether or not we
Mm-hmm.
should be teaching some of the
Mm-hmm.
things about slavery, and or if we should just move on.
Mm-hmm.
Elaborate, if you will, a little bit about that, and how
Mm-hmm.
you see this debate as it rages on.
Mm-hmm. Well, critical race theory, I think, is sort of a red herring. I doubt if people are really teaching actual critical race theory K through 12. This is something that we talk about in law school, and talking about race is not necessarily talking about critical race theory. I mean, critical race theorists talk about race, but not all people who talk about race are critical race theorists. What they're trying to do, what it seems to do, is to sort of block any discussion of conversations that might make white children feel uncomfortable, which to me is a way of saying that black children don't matter. Because how can you say, well, I can't talk about what we can't talk about what happened to your ancestors because it will make these other children feel bad if it's true. I mean, we're not talking about stuff that's made up. You shouldn't be allowed to make up stuff and say, you know this happened. I mean, you can't get around the fact that there was slavery in Texas, and that the republic protected slavery. It's right there in the documents. And unless you're going to not let students read the Constitution of the Republic of Texas, I just don't see how you're going to get around it. And nor should you teach things you have to, nor should you teach things or assume that talking about slavery means that white children are going to feel, that somehow they're responsible for that. I mean, it's a way to say, well, the world was one way and we can make changes. I mean, slavery ended. You can do things differently. And that ought to be the focus rather than saying that if you bring this up, you are accusing white students today of being evil or something. That it just doesn't follow to me. So, I mean, I'm all for being as truthful to children in an age appropriate way as possible. And you can do that. You can talk about slavery with the youngest kids. It's just how it's done that really matters.
And do you think it's just a discomfort with talking about race at all?
Oh yeah,
Hmm.
I think it's discomfort in talking about race, um, and to say that this is a topic that is too volatile. But I think it's how you do it that matters. I've seen great books for children that say Jefferson and Monticello. Mara Kalman has a wonderful book about Jefferson that talks about slavery for kids who are about 5 to 7. And she talks about slavery. She talks about Sally Hemings. She does it in a way that's completely appropriate. And that can be done, I think, throughout all the grades.
Why do you think you are so drawn to really tough subjects like this? I mean, as you mentioned first about Jefferson and
Hmm.
Sally Hemings, now tackling the whole issue of race in Texas. Um, what do you think as a historian really motivates you to pick those difficult conversations?
Well, because these are serious issues, and I want to try, whatever talent, whatever insight I have, to try to tackle some of them. And I don't doubt that maybe how I went to school, how I started going to school, influenced me. I mentioned wondering why. Why is this grown man expressing hostility towards an 8-year-old who has done
Yeah.
nothing to him except come into his store to buy bubble gum? What is this about? Where does this come from? And so I think that questioning nature, that desire to try to to get some answers to that, was why I ultimately became a historian. And I like the tough problems. You know, it, it it's fun to try to untie the knot and to analyze things and come up with answers, and to discuss things with other people who have. I mean, one of the great things about being a historian is the camaraderie of other historians and other people who are interested in these topics, and so it's fun. Actually, it's difficult, but it's not in most instances like work for me in a way. I just feel that it's something that I naturally want to do.
Well, I have to tell you, you're underselling your talent too. You do an amazing job of really bringing it to a place that all of us can understand and appreciate. And at least one theory is, if we don't tell our history, who will? So
Yes.
you know, that's certainly something that I'm sure you think about every day. What was very interesting to me was you said if Texas has an image, it's of white men, and in particular, three kinds of white men: the cowboy, the oil man, and the rancher. But you mentioned that there was this fourth kind of white male that people rarely talk about, which was kind of the impetus for your book.
Yes, the slave plantation owner. Most people think of Texas as the West, and it is the West. It's the Southwest. It has both components, but the southern part of Texas, the southern aspect of Texas, I don't mean the literal southern part, but the part that is like Louisiana and Alabama and Mississippi and Georgia and all those places, it doesn't really register with people. It's all from the film Giant. It's Rock Hudson versus James Dean, the cattleman versus the oil man, and the wildcatter, and no, there are no black people in that. There's no idea that that's a part of who Texans are, who Texas is, what Texas is, I should say. And if you talk about the plantation owner, you necessarily have to talk about the plantation, and then you have to talk about black people. And so, a lot of the things that come out of Texas that people hear about Texas that seem puzzling to them aren't really puzzling if you know that it was a slave society and it was a slave economy. It was part of the Cotton Empire.
Yeah, very much so. And the reason, as you mentioned, why so many people wanted slavery here to help build up their wealth. Well, because Juneteenth is now a national holiday, who do you think really needs to read your book? And we want to sell as many of them as we possibly can, but not just here in Texas, but everywhere. Do you think in the wake of George Floyd, there is just more need for awareness and really more openness to the idea
Oh,
of learning
absolutely.
more?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that event has opened the door for so much, and now it's a responsibility, I think, for all of us who know about this to make sure that young people have this history and can think about ways out of the conundrum, out of the predicament that we're in here. And um, I do think that there's so many great books. We're sort of in a golden age. Clint Smith's book about how the word is passed, Elizabeth Hinton's book about protests in the tradition of protesting in the United States. I mean, we're in a golden age in writing about history and writing about issues of race as well. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff out there. People are historians and scholars are on this, and I think there's a hunger on the part of the citizenry for it. I mean, certainly the reaction to the book, people want to know. People don't want things hidden. They like information and like to feel that they have some understanding of history and why we are where we are at this particular moment. So yeah, this opened the door for a lot.
And do you see ultimately Juneteenth being a holiday, much like MLK Day, that everybody celebrates? Or do you think it will always sort of be exclusively a part of the Black community?
Well, I think it will mainly be in part in the black community, but I think other people will celebrate it as well. I mean, certainly corporations and institutions, universities, and all of these places right now, or at least for the foreseeable future, are going to be involved in mounting programs and so forth that lots of people will be involved in. I've seen, a lot of sort of mixed race celebrations of this or commemorations of it. But I think it would always be something special in the black community, and probably something really special in Texas too. Even though we're very proud of the idea that it's a national holiday, I think this will make Texans even more determined and more, even maybe more chauvinistic about the holiday, more elaborate holidays now that it's national.
Yeah, that's good old Texans. We always like to say everything is bigger and better in Texas. What do you tell your kids, your own kids? I don't know how old they are, but what do you tell them
Hmm.
about Juneteenth?
Well, I told them the story of Juneteenth, and I talked about the kind of foods why we eat the kind of foods we do on the holiday. On the holiday, don't have a lot of my family, or have any of my family actually up here in Texas for this, but we do celebrate, and we pull out pictures and talk about the family and all. They know about this. They always love to come down. It would be great. We should probably plan to do that next year. To come down there with them on the holiday. We've not been there. We've been there for other holidays, but not for Juneteenth. But they're all in it, and they're all square for it. And I'm really, I really wish that I could have. It'd be nice to be down there this year, but next year I definitely want to try to make a plan to be there.
Yeah, I have to tell you, I drove through the hood and everybody was out barbecuing and doing a little bit of whatever they could do to celebrate this monumental change in what has happened. And I want to go ahead and wrap this up in just a second. But as we look at Juneteenth now, I want to go back to your personal feelings. Um,
Hmm.
are you especially proud of this book coming out now and being able to talk about so many of the things that you have discovered and been able to really show other people?
Oh yes, yes. I mean, I'm very glad that we did it when we did. As I said, I was really, I thought that they were going to make it a national holiday, but I thought it would be later.
Yeah.
But this has been great to be able to be in the midst of all of this and to share this with Miss Lee. And we've been on several programs together, and then to meet in the White House was great. Uh, it's a kind of thing that any author would hope for, to be in the middle of a historic event when you're writing about history. So yeah, it's been great.
Wow. And to be one of the most popular authors out there writing about history. You don't always think about that as a page turner, but I
Hmm. Hmm.
must definitely say yours is. Now, I know you no longer live in Texas. You've been up northeast almost since you got to college and law school. Um,
Hmm.
but why do you think you still love your state so much? Love
Hmm.
Texas, even when sometimes it doesn't love us back.
Yeah. Well, I think it's because of my family.
Mhm.
Most of my family is still in Texas. When people, you know, over the years, we were not part of the diaspora, the diaspora that went to California and went other places. A few people did, but not a lot. I don't have a lot of family all over the country. They're all in Texas, and my mother's family goes in one line goes back to the 1820s, and my father's the 1860s. So we've been there. This is deep roots that are there, and it really is the nostalgia that I talked about before that led me to write the book. Thinking about the experiences that I had there with my mother and my father and my brothers and my grandparents and all of those people, those formative experiences have stuck with me, and they were positive, and they were ones that I remember with love and affection. And so that's and I like the outrageousness of Texas in a lot of ways, the outsized sense of self, and that's secondary. But the real thing is family, and in the association of family with that place.
And I'm going to go ahead and make this my last question. But as you're kind of looking at all of this, what do you want your readers to take away from your book? It could have been a tome. It wasn't. It was very intimate, very illuminating in so many ways. But what do you want the average person, and it don't have to be a black average person, but
No, I
anybody
know,
who,
no,
what do you want
anybody,
them to take away? Yeah.
that we're all a part of history, that everybody could tell the story of their family. They could tell the history of their state, the history of their area through their family history. And to think about the ways that history has shaped us all, that we're a part of it. And I want that to come through. And I would also ask people to do something that I didn't do as a kid, and that's pay attention, more attention to the elders in your family, to take family histories if you can. Just record people. If not doing it formally, just listen to the stories. I would give anything to be able to talk to my great grandmother. I wish I'd talked to her more about her life and what it was like to be a black person in East Texas, at the turn of the century, of the last century. And that's it. Just to we are a part of we each a part of history. We can tell history through our lives, and to keep the stories of your family, and pass them down to your children.
That is such a brilliant way to end it because you're right. So many of us don't realize that we've got those nuggets of wisdom and
Hmm.
a look at the long span of history right there in our families. And
Hmm.
so I hope people will take your advice and will take the time to sit down with their elders and tape it or write it down. Because
Hmm.
if there's anything that, as Black folks, we don't do enough, it's actually pass down the history. We'll do it orally, but we don't
Hmm.
necessarily write it down or bring it to anybody
Hmm.
that might want to know. I have to say, this has been such a wonderful conversation, Annette. I really appreciate it. I was so looking forward to it, and you lived up to your billing. So we appreciate the fact that you took the time to spend time with us here in your neck of the woods, as we say.
Yes,
So
yes.
we
Well,
appreciate it
thank you
very.
very much. I've enjoyed this.
It's
Thank you,
been great.
Annette.
Rich stepping in, so that means it's time for me to back off and allow him to take over.
No, Melanie, you are the most amazing interviewer. Thank you for leading a wonderful conversation. And thank you, Annette, for being with us and for really sharing just a great deal that's important and provocative and essential. So thank you. And thanks
Well,
for this
thank you
great
for
book.
inviting me.
No, it's a real privilege and an honor. We wish you the best. Don't forget, folks, buy your copies of On Juneteenth from Kindred Stories, htx.com, and the discount code Inprint. Thanks again to John Guess, the Houston Museum of African American Culture, and all of you for joining us tonight. Hope you'll be with us next Sunday for our Cool Brains event with Jacqueline Woodson. Info about this event and more is at imprinthouston.org. In the meantime, be well, happy reading and writing, and please stay cool and safe. Good night.